Hello, and welcome to Learn Plus. My name is Brenda Bailey Hughes, and I am so delighted that you're here today to learn about self awareness and then some tips for making sure we know how to actually develop that skill in ourselves and in others. That's the plus. We always get a tool for taking this content that we're talking about live and then making it available to others in our lives who we are in the training room with, the classroom with, or with whom we coach. I am delighted today to introduce you to my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Ray Luther. Ray is the director of our MBA Leadership Academy at the Kelley School of Business. He also is the executive director of an organization that works in partnership with companies all over the world in terms of bringing them coaching excellence and personal leadership skills. Ray is an esteemed and awarded faculty member at the Kelley School's Management and Entrepreneurship Department. I have just been so honored to co-create and co-facilitate a variety of executive education types of engagements with Ray. My first time to meet Ray, though, I was tasked with teaching one of the first required communication leadership courses at the Kelley School for undergrads. And I said to all of my colleagues and the deans in my school, like, okay, who do I need to talk to make sure I have the best, most up-to-date literature and understanding of leadership? And everybody said, you need to talk to Ray, you need to talk to Ray, you need to talk to Ray. So I hosted this lunch. I bought him a little box lunch and had him over to the building that I was teaching in. And I think he brought some of his colleagues from the Leadership Academy, and everybody sat down to talk to me about leadership. And I kid you not, I couldn't eat because I had so many questions that I needed to ask Ray as he started talking. And I wrote 14 pages of notes. I still have them in a folder somewhere. I had 14 pages of handwritten notes just over a cold cut sandwich because he's such a wealth of information. I learned so much from him. I still learn so much from Ray. And I think you will too. We're focusing today specifically on self-awareness. And my entree into self-awareness is through the work that I do in the emotional intelligence space. Ray looks at self-awareness from the leadership space and has such a unique and interesting spin on it that I think you're going to learn a ton from Ray. So what I would love for all of you that are listening to do is maybe in the chat, tell us why you were attracted to a class, a live conversation about self-awareness. What are you hoping to learn today? I'll be honest, Ray and I could wax on philosophically about self-awareness and self-awareness practices for give us 2 days and we might exhaust what we would love to talk about. So if you tell us in the chat kind of the things you're interested in, that will help us focus our conversation a bit more around the things that are interesting to you. So why are you here? What do you hope to learn about self-awareness, about teaching others self-awareness? Just let us know and we'll get there. I'm seeing some people are piping in. That's great. So good to see all of you. So glad that you're here. Shelby, let's get Ray in here in the room. I've been blabbing on about him, but let's introduce him to our listeners. Ray Luther, friends. Ray, hi, welcome.
Hey, Brenda. Hey, everyone. Glad to be here. Thank you so much. And I appreciate all the kind words.
All true, all true. So good to see you. So Ray, let's start as they're giving us some understanding of where they're coming from and what they're intrigued by. I would love for you to start us with just generally, how do you describe self-awareness? I know every researcher I read, I can get a slightly different or nuanced definition of self-awareness. What is it to you? Or maybe more importantly, sort of paint the portrait for us of a leader who demonstrates self-awareness contrasted to a leader in similar situations that maybe doesn't show up with quite the same degree of self-awareness.
Yeah, I thank you. Really great question, and it's a complicated answer. I mean, people throw around the words self-awareness like it's a very easy thing, and I sometimes feel like people just want to think harder. And if I think harder about myself, I'll build self-awareness, and actually that's somewhat contrary to the truth. We need to We need to actually move into some observation modes, some perspectives from others, etc. And so when I think about self-awareness, I like to think about it from a very practical side as a coach. I think there's a lot of theoretical foundations of what does it mean to be self-aware, and can you even be self-aware? And there's some literature that gets very twisted around whether or not we can have this thing called self-awareness. And I want to step back from that and just say, as a leader coach, somebody who's leading others, it is one of the most foundational, critical components of being a good leader. But it's not as easy to develop as it first appears, because one of my favorite stats comes from Tasha Urich. And by the way, I'm going to try to cite a lot of different folks here that I'm a big fan of, but Tasha did some work that showed 85% of people she surveyed thought they were highly self aware. And then when measured by any objective measure, the real number was around 15%. And so that gap is largely what we're dealing with in a lot of leadership development programs, because self-awareness as a construct influences everything as a leader. It influences, how do I lead myself, right? Am I consistent with my values? Am I consistent with my purpose? Am I making decisions that are lined up? Do I do what I say I would do, right? That's a component of being aware. But then also, how do others experience me? Do they experience me in a way that's consistent with how I'm trying to present myself, or do they have a much different perspective of me, right? And
Yeah.
so it can get, the I think the landscape can get pretty complicated quickly. But I loved your boiled down question. When I have a leader who's self-aware, I have a leader who knows their identity pretty well, the global identity, which is the story they tell themselves about themselves. They're not afraid of observation about themselves, meaning they can notice when they have good meetings, they can notice when they have bad meetings, they can notice when they have good decisions or bad decisions, and they're willing to incorporate the external perspective that helps them build their own self-awareness on how other people are experiencing them. That's going to be a leader that is very confident, assured, is going to be leading from a place that I would say a lot of people want to follow. This is somebody that people would generally trust. Somebody who's not self-aware is probably more reactionary than they have any idea that they are. They have no idea how they come across to other people, right? Or it's inconsistent at best. And they probably are out of tune with how they would describe themselves versus how they're experienced by other people, which is going to lead to a lot of mistrust and other areas that are going to really inhibit that leader from living up to their full potential.
Yeah, I'm curious that for those of you who are listening, if you've experienced working with a leader who you consider to have been self-aware, how was that experience compared to a leader that you might have worked with that wasn't so self-aware? If you have stories or anecdotes or examples about that, put those in the chat. Ray, you mentioned Tasha Urich's work, and you said uh, that that sometimes the misconception about self-awareness is that if I just think harder, I will have more self-awareness. And I remember Tasha talking about this. I think she called it navel gazing. Like, I'm just going to stare at my navel and hope to suddenly know more about myself. And even cautioned us against asking too many why questions about ourselves. She said that doesn't actually grow the kinds of healthy self-introspection that we would think would grow your self-awareness. Have you found that there are better ways than others to, or ways we should avoid trying to enhance our self-awareness?
Yeah, it's so I such a great question. And Anuja on the start comments asked something similar. How do we not cross the line from building self-awareness to getting into self-criticalness? And that is absolutely spot on. If we go too far, it can lead to rumination, and rumination has been shown time and time again to be an unproductive activity. Rumination sounds like, why did I do that in the meeting? I can't believe I'm so silly or stupid. I can't believe I actually said that. And we get into this overly self-critical nature without the ability to be self-compassionate, that we're just humans and we might make mistakes. And Kristen Neff has done some wonderful work around self-compassion and how we need to detach from some of these things. I think in building self-awareness, what's really critical is the questions we ask ourselves and what we're willing to explore. when I'm exploring things like my values and what I value most and how those values might influence how I think and feel about things, I'm asking myself very open ended questions about why those are important to me. Or if I'm asking myself questions about my passions, Yurik would say as well, I would call that my purpose. What's my purpose in life? Or how do I think about these things? I'm really exploring. I'm not critiquing, right?
Mm,
So I want to avoid, if possible, the why did you? It's too
yeah.
easy to go there. And instead I want to say, well, that's interesting. What can I observe about that moment? And what's in line with how I want to show up, and what might be out of line. Maybe I had a bad day, maybe it was reactionary, whatever it happens to be. I should be aware that I'm, capable of that behavior. And at the same time, I should also have a little bit of self compassion that maybe there were some other things going on that I wasn't as conscious of that I could have been.
Yeah. Anusha, I hope that answered, spoke to that because it was such a great question. Yeah, I know I need to be self-aware, but I don't want to become so self-aware that I'm hyper vigilant, I'm hypersensitive, and I'm self-conscious about everything. So yeah, there's that great balance, and a lot of it is I love that comment that I'm not self-critiquing, I'm self-observing, and there's just this huge difference there.
Well, and there's times when you need to metaphorically give yourself the kick in the butt, right? There's that it's a fine line. You don't want to say I'm never going to critique myself, but it's the obsessive critiquing, especially over obsessive critiquing over future or past activities where you're not really boiling down to what are my tendencies? What are the things that might have caused this behavior or this thought or feeling to show up, and how can I think about those going forward? Is that consistent with my values? Is that consistent with my purpose, my aspirations, whatever it happens to be? So it's just a fine line of getting it right, but observation is that key that kind of unlocks a lot of this stuff. Observation and questions.
Even the questions you're asking today are illustrative of the kinds of questions that are going to be helpful to us in this self-awareness journey. So if I am at a meeting and I've made a conscious commitment that I'm not going to interrupt people anymore, it's not in alignment with my values, it's not empathetic, it's not who I want to be as a communicator, and I walk out of that meeting and I know that I interrupted at least 4 times, I can go on this spiral of sort of self criticism and shame of, oh, why do I interrupt? Why am I such a blabbermouth? Why? It gets me nowhere. Instead, to say, what was happening when I interrupted? How can I move past this communicative behavior that's not as healthy as I'd like it to be? Those what and how questions seem to be so much more productive to me than why.
Absolutely. The what and how are going to be great. The why tends to elicit defensiveness. And I think in that scenario, boy, what amped up power you could get too of maybe using a buddy or a pal in the meeting to say, "Hey, I'm trying to limit how much I interrupt. I think I interrupt too much. Can you just help me be a little bit more aware of when that comes up in case I don't notice?"
No,
Right? And now I'm
when that
yeah,
happens.
now I'm building awareness from both myself and what I might be able to observe and also somebody else's perspective. And that person's perspective, how they perceive us is very, very real. It's their data, right? We understand our intentions on the inside. They can only see our behaviors. And so in seeing those behaviors, they're making their own story, they're telling their own story, they have their own assumptions, etc. And if you have somebody who's willing to be very objectively honest with you on here's what I observed, that's a great way to build your own self-awareness around whatever you're trying to understand.
Teresa, I wonder, Teresa Keefe has a question about it's hard for me to ask others for blind spots. What are alternatives? And I wonder if Ray's suggestion just then, you've already identified an awareness area. I want to quit interrupting. And I single out that piece for observation with my accountability buddy, if you will, rather than just opening it up to, hey, do I have any blind spots? That would be a bit intimidating perhaps. But Ray, is there anything else you'd want to speak to Teresa's question?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one, exactly what you said, Brenda. Try to notice those and observe those for yourself. Two, here's where I really love Marshall Goldsmith's method of feed forward, and just reverse the question if you're asking others for blind spots. Instead of asking for feedback, how did I do in the meeting? Marshall flips it and says, "Hey, if I were to go do this thing again, what would you recommend for me in the future?" Right? And really try to help the person understand that you're seeking that kind of critique. They won't necessarily give you the feedback, well, do this differently that you did in the last meeting, but they'll most likely use that feedback to build upon what they would tell you to do in the future. Hey, I think you might want to be more confident as you present, or I think I would work a little harder on understanding some of the details. The other thing that I'm a big fan of is the Center for Creative Leadership Situation Behavior Impact tool. And you can use that to seek feedback, Teresa. If, hey, I'm interested in talking to Brenda. Brenda, when we trained together last time, that's the situation. I stood in front of the classroom and I kind of went off and told some jokes that went on and on. That's the behavior. I'm curious the impact that you think that had on the classroom or on you. That's the impact. So I'm using that model to kind of seek in a very safe way for the person who might be giving it to me. I'm outlining those criteria for them to play within a container space that it would really help me to understand.
Yeah. We're going to talk more about building self awareness, but I see a couple of users are intrigued by the idea of how do we introduce others to self awareness? Jessica's asking, they don't have a background in EI. They're not on the live with us right now. We have another LinkedIn user that says, what are the best techniques to help someone towards self awareness? How do you identify a genuine lack of self awareness? So, yeah, let's kind of, are there ways to coach towards self-awareness if we're not thinking about ourselves so much, although we're going to come back to that certainly, but if we're thinking about others, how do you coach others towards self-awareness?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I mean, as a coach, my primary starting point is always I need to meet someone where they are, right? And most of us are working in scenarios where people have a general level of self awareness, or they wouldn't have been hired into the types of organizations that the majority of people here are working for. If it's completely non-existent, then I'm starting from ground zero, but I highly doubt that, right? So where do I start from? I have to get an assessment of how well does this person understand their own emotional domains, right? Are they reactive or are they more controlled? I can get a general sense of that. I don't know what's going on inside of them, but I can generally tell if somebody's reactive or if somebody is kind of tampering that response. And then also how curious are they about how they impact others? What's going on as they show up, and are they concerned on how they might, influence others' emotions? If I can get a good sense of those two questions, then I might know where to start. And and really where I would start in trying to help somebody build self-awareness is just say the basic questions. What do you value, right? What are those things that are most important to you that, help you decide whether something's right or wrong, whether something's good or bad? Maybe I take them through a simple value sort exercise and try to go deeper onto why these things are important to them. Maybe it's from a spiritual home, or maybe it's from their parents, or maybe it's from some other source, some mentor or something, but they're probably going to have some values that they can start to outline. And in that conversation we might be able to determine, hey, here's why these things are important to me. Here's where I tend to get either upset or I feel very happy. Great. How do we start to notice our own feelings, right? I mean, when people say emotions, I don't know. I feel like sometimes in organizations we just want to tamp emotions down, as opposed to what are the signals that emotions are telling us. If I'm experiencing an emotion in a meeting, what's going on that's actually evoking that emotion to show up? If you have a pit in your stomach before you go into your meeting with the big boss, that's not your brain saying, "Hey brain, I got a meeting with the boss, form a pit." No, that's actually something that shows up, and then your brain tries to make sense of it. Why do I have a pit in my stomach? It's an emotional response, and all of that's a component of our self-awareness. Wow, I'm actually moving into a bit of fight or flight before this meeting. Maybe that's telling me something that I want to be aware of relative to how I want to prepare for the meeting, why I might take it so seriously, how I might want to involve others, et cetera, et cetera. But I can notice those signals as opposed to just trying to ignore it and power through.
Yeah. Dr. Andrew Lears points out in the chat that slowing the emotion as a mental technique. We've got this super fast society. We've become so fast, just almost we become too fast for our emotions. I love that. You're too fast for emotions. And Ray, I've heard you talk about that sort of the power of the pause and that reflective moment, not just as a way to self-regulate, but I can see it now in the context of what you just said as a way to open ourselves to self-awareness as well.
Yeah, I think the good doctor here makes a great point. Have we become too fast for emotions? In some ways, maybe. I mean, emotions are very blunt instruments, and I'm not a scientific expert in emotions. I'm more of a applied coach who's looking to help people notice their own emotions. I think where we might be able to do some work for ourselves is how do we become less reactive? How do we become less susceptible to the emotional response where it is a pure reactionary mode, and can we build awareness of when those moments are coming up to try to allow ourselves as humans to experience those emotions as all of us do. And I think Susan David's work's done quite a bit there with some of her work on emotional agility, etc.
Yeah. Neil Johnson, thank you for your comment. Does self-awareness, he's thinking that self-awareness really helps mitigate imposter syndrome. What do you think, Ray? Does it help or hurt imposter syndrome to be more self-aware? If I'm an
um
imposter, it wouldn't be a syndrome then. I'm just truly an imposter. I don't know. What do you think?
I think self-awareness, I that it's a great question. I don't have a very solid answer to that, or one that might be highly satisfying. I would hypothesize that if we can build self-awareness and we can start to help the person recognize everything they bring to the table, right? And everything that they are good at, they are skilled at, they are dealing with relative to whatever they're struggling with imposter syndrome about, that might be somewhat reassuring or somewhat um, help them in some way, at least face that challenge, right? And if I were coaching somebody in that space, I would want to do some small experiments on how could we use that knowledge of those skills, that increased consciousness of those skills, to bring that to the table where they were feeling that fear, where they were feeling that anxiety
Yeah,
going through.
yeah, makes so much sense. We always want to give you a tool to use as part of Learn Plus. The tool this time around is this self-observant model that I first learned from Ray. I think he and a colleague developed this. Shelby, I think we've got a visual of this that Shelby in the background is going to pull up for us. Yeah, here we go. So the self-observant leader, and again, this isn't leader as necessarily a titled leader, but all of us and just in our organizations as we're leading others, influencing others, creating great changes. Talk us through, Ray, what your thinking was going into this model and how it can be of use to those of us who are trying to expand not only our own self-awareness, but coach others to a heightened level of self-awareness too. And help us understand what internal and external sense making is all about.
So thanks, Brenda. I co-created this model with Eric Johnson, who's a colleague of mine. He previously was with the Kelly School. Now he's an independent coach and CEO of a recovery organization. And we use this with our MBA Leadership Academy. We actually just finished teaching this year's version last week. We had the self-observant leader model out, and we started with this. Really, the whole premise was as we work with our MBA students in becoming more self-aware, we wanted them to increase their ability to be self-observant. How can I notice myself when I'm in a variety of scenarios, and how can I notice how I'm making sense of the world? What is it that's influencing me? And so the first level, if we start with the top and the center to become more self-observant, it's really first, let's just be self-honest. Do I have a good sense of how I see myself? Let's call that our identity. And do I have a good sense of how other people see me? Let's call that our reputation. And I'm not necessarily, we don't argue that you have to necessarily reconcile those to be perfectly matched. But if we have a good sense of this global identity, there's research that shows we have multiple identities. We're going to push some of that aside. Just what's the general story I tell myself about myself? And if I'm talking with others, what's the general story that gets played back? And
I,
if I have a good sense of those, I'm honest with myself.
Right. I think that's really interesting that you say they don't have to be completely reconciled. So does that mean that if I know that this is the way this is the story I tell about myself, that I see these are as my values, and this is how I want to engage in the world, and this is my personality, whatever the things are that make my story mine, and I happen to know that someone else may not see me that way, that's not the end of the world.
No, I
As
think
long
it
as I know how they see me, it doesn't always have to align perfectly with the way
right.
I
I think it warrants some good questions. Why might they see me differently, right? Like, am I showing up differently? But the fact that it's not a perfect match, I don't worry about personally, because I think it's okay. We're very complex creatures that might even have some inconsistencies, God forbid,
well,
right?
and
And even
there's
in
the
those,
idea, isn't there that idea that there's kind of a front stage self and a backstage self?
yeah,
And
all of
my
Goffman's
backstage
work.
self is my story, like kicked off shoes, and this is who I am. But boy, when I'm in front of everybody, I don't know that that's exactly who needs to show up.
That's exactly right. All of Goffman's work very much informs this on front stage, backstage. So this identity and reputation, let's just say, okay, that's a placeholder. So we
Right.
know where we want to be. From there, we can come to a class like this. We can go to a workshop. We can work with our boss, and we can say, what's the deliberate practice we want to engage in? How do I want to live my values? How can I be more present? How can I know my purpose? Whatever it is for you that you're working towards, and coaching can really help here. You're basically making a commitment. You haven't done anything yet, but you're saying, I want to go be this way. And then you notice life is at the bottom. And so you go live life. And as you're living life, some of these elements come out naturally, some might not, but you're allowed to suddenly notice and observe you've got a couple different sense making or feedback processes going on. One is an internal sense making process. How am I making sense of the world? That, oh, by the way, is being filtered through things like my personality preferences, my purpose and values, my own sense of somatic awareness, like where I notice something physically in my body, that pit in my stomach that we talked about, my ability to be self compassionate or resilient. All of that informs how I make sense of a situation, right? About me or about others that I'm interacting with. And that's my internal sense making process. And coaching can help make sense of that as well, right? A coach can help us inform that more. Hey, I notice that you have a personality trait of being very detail oriented, and you get very upset when your teammates are not detail oriented, right? Maybe that's something we ought to explore, of why that's so bothersome to you, to build your self-awareness. That helps us become self-observant. Then we have this external side as well, running up the right-hand side. And this can come in a variety of formats. These are formats that our MBAs are familiar with. So experiential learning or systems thinking, 360 feedback, where you get feedback from everybody who's around you. We do an exercise called the user's manual, where you write a personal user's manual on how best to work with you. All of those things can give us the external perspective, where sense making is coming from outside. Hey, here's what I see from you, right? They're making sense of us showing up. We just need to understand what that is as best we can. By the way, coaching can help us make sense of that. Both of those things, though, can allow us to observe. And if we have enough observational data points, then we can go in and we can be self-honest as well. Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Kennedy School summed up this up really well. He has a metaphor. He's like, listen, as a leader, we need to be on the dance floor and on the balcony at the same time. And we need to go dance, and we need to observe ourselves dancing. And that's really complicated, because it's hard to do both things at once. But that's what we're trying to do, is say, how can I observe and notice myself in the act in life, so that I can build my self-awareness? That is how I'm showing up. How I showed up in my last meeting is how I'm showing up, right? How
Right.
Brenda experiences me in that meeting is her perspective, which is valid to me understanding my reputation and building my self-awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. When you started with daily life, and I love that the model emphasizes that this self observant leader approach, or becoming more self-honest, getting my identity and my reputation sorted out in my head clearly. I don't have to. It wouldn't hurt to, but this isn't something that always has to happen in a classroom or in a special engagement. That I think I've heard you use a term, just drafting off life as the tool. Could you talk to a little bit about what that phrase means to you, and how all of us can just use life as this mechanism for continuing this cycle? And I also love that the system is all interrelated, that
Yeah.
there's just that continuous feedback.
Yeah, at when I used to work at Procter and Gamble, and at Procter and Gamble, I had an older marketing director, and you walked in, and he was very intimidating. And on the front of his desk that you would face if you had to have a conversation, it said, "Training is happening now."
Ah,
And his point was like, we're training all the time, right? And it's there's a two-way street here, and I think self-awareness is quite a bit the same. I mean, what I love about the work I do as a coach working on leadership is there's not a day that goes by that you don't have a chance to work on this stuff. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be an hour-long journaling session. It can be simply noticing, how am I showing up in my professional life today? Right? Can I write down 3 values that I want to honor, and can I identify where I did that in a day? That's building self observation and self awareness. When I'm on family vacation, am I showing up consistently with how I want to be with my family? Right? Or am I in some ways different, or whatever it happens to be? So, what I have hope for is this is a very, while the model looks a little complicated, it's not intended to be. It's a very accessible. You have the ability to observe yourself in lots of different situations, right? Many of us get behind the wheel of a car and we become different people, right? And that's, we get frustrated with traffic and we let everybody know about it. That's something to take note of, right? That's how we show up in various contexts, is it says something about us, and that's all a component of being self-awareness. Now, what I would also try to say is, I'm a big fan of withholding judgment as long as possible. So just because we
about
build
what you're
awareness
seeing.
about what we're noticing,
Okay.
and trying to build that self-compassion muscle to say, if I didn't show up the way I want to today, how might I evolve that or change that for tomorrow? Right? I have a chance to get better. And what is that I need to do to get better? So as long as possible, observe, withhold judgment, practice self-compassion, try to get more towards your intention.
Yeah. I think holding that judgment can be so challenging. Oh,
Oh yeah.
gosh, that's hard. Any tips on how, I mean, how do we just, I just that constant reminder, I guess, that I'm observing. Your friend Mark, I went to a class with Mark. You can tell the group a little bit about Mark. But one of the things I remember him saying is observing is winning. Like observing is the goal. If you do that, you've already accomplished what you set out to do. Not I observed it and I critiqued it and I changed it. No, I observed it. I observed something. That's a win.
Right, right. Yeah, Mark is a long-term practitioner of the contemplative arts, as he calls himself. He's a Buddhist chaplain, and he's kind of an expert in what we might call mindfulness, although he hates that term. He usually says mindful awareness. And he would say, to your point, how do you just get to that place of non-judgmental awareness, the non-judgmental observation? Can you hold something and just notice it? Don't necessarily label it good or bad. I think Susan David does a good job of this when she talks about emotions. Why is it, she calls it the tyranny of the positive? Why is it that we need to label emotions as good or bad? Or why do we feel bad about having certain emotions and in fact try to ignore them, as opposed to saying, why am I angry right now? Why am I frustrated right now? And I think that gets more into more of a global acceptance of what these emotions or self-awareness might be telling us about our overall experience.
And there were one of the users one of our listeners had asked about, well, wait, aren't there times when I was sort of critiquing why questions earlier and saying, no, what and how seems to get me better movement than these why questions. But in some instances, that why question is important. You just gave two really good examples. Yeah. How do we know our own motivations? That's a time when a why question is a great uh, option. Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, the coach in me is going to push back. I think why tends to elicit defensiveness.
You mentioned that.
And if we become defensive, we often become reactionary. And what I would caution us against is moving ourselves into a reactionary oh my god, that was stupid,
Yeah.
right? Whereas we might be able to understand our motivations outside of a why question. I have plenty of coaching clients that can understand their motivations outside of why questions, right? Where if I can play off of even intrinsic motivation is consists of how autonomous am I, how much relatedness or meaning do I find, and how much am I getting some sort of competence out of what I'm trying to do. I can build those without necessarily asking myself a lot of why questions. So I think if it's, I won't tell you never do it. If it's what works for you, that's fine. If it's what you're doing and it's quickly leading to rumination or judgment, then I
Mm,
might suggest try something else. How might we become a little bit different than we, showed up today? What would happen if we tried to do it this way, right?
mm.
And it might seem a little bit just semantics, but it's actually, I think, a little bit more powerful than that.
So the example that you mentioned was I realized I was really angry about something. And instead of just ignoring that or labeling it as positive or negative, the tyranny of the positive, what would happen if I said, why am I angry? Now, is that a good use of the why question, or is even there a different question going to get me more self understanding?
You sound like my MBA students from last week. They got hung up on this why question. My suggestion again, it would be try what works for you.
Yeah.
I think the why question more often than not leads to that kind of defensive posture, and so I would encourage people to try and at least work around it as possible. Okay,
So
if
it's
it it
why am I angry? There's almost an inherent judgment in the question, isn't there? Instead,
yeah.
I'm observing that I'm feeling angry, and that in and of itself is a win because
Hmm.
I figured it out. I've got that. I've noticed it. I'm observing. That's a win right there. That's great. Yeah, good. I would be curious, listeners, how do you imagine using the model that Ray shared with us? We can pull that back up so you can see it again for just a second. Yeah, which pieces of this are speaking to you? Where do you see making adjustments in the way you move forward after being here with us? Which parts of this might you use, or in what scenarios or situations do you imagine yourself stepping into this sort of self-observant leadership mode as as opposed to what you came in with today, which was beautiful and wonderful. But I want you to leave transformed. I want you to leave having an action item for yourself. What would that look like as you look through this? When people see this, Ray, is there a starting spot where most people sort of can get hooked into this approach, or is there an easy way in, an ease ourselves into the manual? Somebody's commenting that they love the user manual. Yes, it's a great exercise. When I've seen him use this, always love the user manual. Maybe
Yeah,
tell
and
us a little bit more about the questions in the user manual.
well, the user's manual was an exercise we actually pulled and modified from the New York Times. And if you go back and search some of the New York Times archives, I think Adam Bryant wrote about his experience with the user's manual. And we ask questions and we force the writing because it drives a different level of understanding. How you have to write this out. So if I were writing my user's manual, I would write, how do I like to receive feedback? How do I like feedback given to me? How do I like to give feedback? How do people get a gold star with me? Maybe some other core questions. And I would ask questions about how I show up on a team. And then I would have to hand that to Brenda, and she should be able to read it and understand how to work with me. Now, what Brenda can do is say, Ray, I've worked with you. I don't know if this is true. Or Brenda can say, I don't know if I have enough clarity on what you mean by this point. Can you expand so I have more clarity? And the intent would be to get you to write out this level of self awareness. Typically, it takes a couple rounds. And we do it in a very safe environment. I've done this with Fortune 500 companies. No kidding, a Fortune 500 company that's not too far from us in Indiana. Um, I was doing it with about 50 people, and half of them, this one woman raised her hand and said, I cannot wait to go share this with my boss. And the
Oh,
other half one woman raised her hand and said, "I would never share this with my boss." And
Interesting.
it really drove an interesting conversation about vulnerability and psychological safety of what was driving two very different responses
Within the same
on
organization.
same organization, basically just slightly different business units. And so it showed, I think, how much the leader dictated somewhat the cultural environment across that organization. um
Which underscores why, as leaders ourselves, we've got to figure out this self awareness piece because we are driving that kind of culture, that kind of reaction that these two people had in the same organization. So different about, yeah, such different um, types of reactions. I'm noticing that people are responding to my question about where you're going to get started. And Shelby and Neil are both saying values are a really good starting point for them. Shelby wants to get those articulated more clearly, maybe even written down. Do you have tips for us or resources that we could use to sort of tease out those values and get really clear on those?
Yeah, I have a couple. There's well, my favorite values tool, to be very honest with you, is just journaling and observing. And if I can do quick journaling and observe myself on where I feel particularly motivated about a project, a person, or whatever, there's probably a value that's rewarded. And if I can also do quick journaling about a project that's just killing me or a person I don't want to deal with or whatever, there's probably a value that's being violated in some way. So I like to go a bit more bespoke. If you want a quick kind of instrument to get you started, I'm a big fan of VIA character strengths, and you can take a free assessment on VIA's website. You just type in VIA character strengths. The organization started out being known as Values in Action. That's why it's VIA. They just relabeled what they capture as character strengths instead of values, but there's a lot of similarities there. So that's a good one to start with. There are also values card sort exercises. And so if you look up there's some E ones on there that you can look up a card sort exercise, and you have to keep reducing the amount. The intent is really to get to about 5 to 7 values that you can look at and you can say, yeah, that's what's driving my thoughts and feelings, which ultimately drives my behavior.
Yeah.
Right? The values underline whether I think something it's a good idea or bad idea. The values underline whether I feel good or bad about something. Both of those things underline my behavior and how I choose to show up.
I'm
Right? And that's why it's really foundational.
I'm loving the takeaways they're sharing with us. And I want to get to Marjorie's question about getting feedback from her volunteers. You mentioned SBI, but my takeaway from this is I'm going to engage in that activity of thinking about the projects and the relationships where I feel like I'm just blossoming there. I'm just thriving. I'm loving it. I'm having a great time. I'm doing great work. And then contrast that to some projects where I just feel like the life is sucked out of me every time I have to open this project again, because I love that idea, Ray, that it's probably pointing me towards a value that's either being supported and aligned with, or that I'm in some kind of value misalignment or a values violation in these projects that are not fun. And I think that's going to be a really interesting way for me to approach it. Because like Dr. Anders Lear said, I do like my diaries, I like my journaling, and this gives me a great entry into that. Okay, Marjorie gets the closing question for the day, and that is, I want more feedback from these volunteers, but as volunteers, gosh, it's hard for them to say, I need you to change this. I'm not happy with that. Any thoughts on, and I love the frame, the situation, behavior, impact. So you're guiding them, give them that tool. Say, in this situation, this was my behavior. How did that impact you, or how did that impact our clientele? That's certainly one rich approach. And you can read more about SBI, framed more as how to give feedback, but this flipping it that Ray does is really interesting. And that is you can find that in the Creative Center for Leadership. Ray, other thoughts for Marjorie on how do we, and broadening it, not just volunteers, but for all of you listening, how do we get feedback from others, knowing how essential that is, that external sense making piece that Ray showed us in the model? We've got to get some external feedback to see the whole picture. How do we do it?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Amy Edmondson's latest work on psychological safety and what that means for a team. And it doesn't just mean hugging it out, it means creating a space where somebody's not afraid to share their perspective or their opinion, even if it might be unpopular. Right. And it happens a lot in innovation spaces where people hold back with their ideas. It also can happen in hierarchical relationships and a lot of different ways. So without knowing all the details, Marjorie, one of the questions I would ask is how psychologically safe is the space to do that? Is there something there? Why is it that you might suspect that they're afraid and unhappy? You must be getting some sort of feedback to have that as an assumption, right? And so one thing you can do is lower the risk for them. How do you lower the risk to understand what their experience is and what might not be working for them or how they might make it better? If it's a volunteer organization, maybe you can co-create a space where they get some input and they get to be a part of the solution. That could go a long way to maybe addressing some of their concerns. I always do this little question with my classes. I'll say, who in here has ever really wanted to give somebody feedback, like feedback that could genuinely help them, but chose not to? And inevitably, everybody raises their hand, and I'll ask why, and they say it wasn't the right time, it wasn't my place, it wasn't going to be received. The person would respond well. I hear a litany of answers, and I'll say, okay, I want to ask a different question. Who in here has ever thought that somebody wants to have or has feedback for you that could really change how you show up, and for whatever reason they didn't? And eventually they all raise their hand and I say yes, and why? And the answer is the same reasons,
Yeah.
right? And so I
It
think
wasn't the
with
right timing. It wouldn't be received well. The very same answers.
yeah, and so it's not necessarily to overly critique us, it's to say, if I want that feedback, how am I showing up with my organization to genuinely be curious on things that maybe are a little painful for me to hear because they involve decisions I've made or the way in which I show up, etc. And how can I create an environment where it's okay to share that? And those are really tough questions to address. This isn't easy. If I had the answer, we'd have a much broader production than we do today, right? I'd have better plants behind me at least. But what I can encourage is if you put forward the time and say, I have the intention of doing this and I'm trying to be genuine as I approach it, and you ask people for that feedback, the more genuine they feel and the more they trust you, the more you'll get, I think, an honest perspective out of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we have our takeaways. We've all got our action steps here to take us forward. One other action step you might take is my communicating with emotional intelligence class. Once we have it, emotional intelligence is divided into a number of quadrants. Four quadrants. Self awareness is one of those. We've spent a lot of time talking about how to develop that self awareness, that how do we project that we are self-aware? What does that look like to the world when we project self-awareness? So I speak to that a little bit in that communicating with emotional intelligence course in the LinkedIn library that you have access to. My next live is September 26th. We're trying a slightly different time. It's going to be later in the afternoon Eastern time, 3:30 p.m. that day. It's going to be with my colleague, Ray's colleague as well, Tatiana Kolovu. She will be here to talk about our effective listening class and some listening tips. Our listening course has hit over 1.25 million viewers. So there's something happening in there, people. I don't know if it's that we've all moved to remote settings and listening takes a slightly different flavor or what it is, but apparently the topic of listening is hot right now. So we're going to talk about that. Ray, I am so grateful for your time today and for your insights and wisdom. I didn't take quite 14 pages of notes because I was trying to read the user's notes, but I was taking notes again. Always will when I'm with you. Michelangelo reminded us at the ripe old age of 87 that I am still learning, and we are all still learning. So keep learning, everyone. Thank you for being here and have a great day.
Thanks, Brenda.